Welcome, everybody. So nice to see you, and thank you for making time today for attending this webinar. Elizabeth and I are going to talk about how to transform a DNP capstone project into a publishable manuscript. I'm Sue Fowler. I am the editor of our Ambulatory Care Nursing Journal, but a little bit about me. I've been an editor before for the Ophthalmic Nursing Journal, and have sat on many editorial boards and manuscript review boards. I do have a passion for writing, but more importantly, I think I have a passion for mentoring others in the writing process. So that's a little bit about me. I'm going to have Elizabeth introduce herself, and then we can go on to our slides.
Thanks, Sue. I'm Elizabeth, the editor of Viewpoint, and like Sue, I've had a lot of opportunities to review manuscripts, and especially DNP capstone manuscripts, both in my role as the editor for Viewpoint and also as a peer reviewer for a couple other journals. And I've also had the opportunity to see a lot of ways where I think people could just be a little bit better prepared to make that leap from what they submitted for school to what now needs to be submitted to a journal. So really happy to partner with Sue today to present some pointers for anybody who's working on that kind of a project.
Okay, so Elizabeth and I are here today as editors of these two journal, AAACN publications, not in our our jobs. And as you know, the Journal for Ambulatory Care Nursing is launching in March of 2025. Okay, so what we want you to come away with today is really identify the guidelines that are applicable and appropriate for DNP capstone projects, especially when it was related to quality improvement. We want you to describe some of your challenges and how do you take a school required paper and turn it into a publication. And finally, we want you to review and understand kind of the publication process. Elizabeth will give you some overview, then we'll give you some nuances both for Viewpoint as well as the journal. And now I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth.
All right, so I'll start off with a few general recommendations that are really related to issues we see quite frequently across the board. Then Sue will talk more about reporting guidelines and how to structure your manuscripts. Then we'll go into a little bit more depth on expectations specifically for quality improvement initiatives, because these are the most common DNP capstone papers that we see. And we'll talk about shortening your manuscript and then some general pointers. So our number one recommendation is to cut the fluff, by which we mean not just obvious fluff like extra words, colloquialisms, figures of speech that add words but no real content. But also in this context, we're referring to procedure. A lot of times when we see manuscripts that haven't really been pared down yet coming out of the DNP programs or sometimes PhD programs, there is way too much detail on very specific procedures and a lot of minutiae that may have been necessary for your school program to document that you've met those competencies and you understand the minutia, but you just can't fit all that into a typical journal's page limit or word limit. So things like the nitty-gritty of precisely how you communicated to your team that you were about to launch an initiative, or which drawer was locked up with information that was being kept confidential. You do want to address procedures and you do want to address confidentiality, but we don't need the great level of detail that we often see. Same thing applies to frameworks or quality improvement models. Yes, you do need to tell us what frameworks, theories, or models you're using. But unlike what may have been required for your capstone paper that you turned into your committee, chair, advisor, school, you probably don't need to go into a lot of detail about the history of the framework or every component of the QI model that you used. Just tell us what you used, give a couple sentences of explanation, and cite your source, because your readers can either look up the source and go read about it more in depth for themselves, or your contact info is on the manuscript. They can reach out to you if they do want a little bit more detail about some of those procedures or bits that don't really fit into the journal article. Also, do remove any colloquialisms or unnecessary words. We see a lot of overuse of the. Take out the anywhere it's not absolutely necessary. We also sometimes see manuscripts that feel kind of like you would write a letter, where it just feels like the person is writing like they talk, like you're having a conversation. And that's beautiful if you're writing a personal letter to a friend. It's not appropriate in an academic manuscript. Your manuscript should almost sound a little bit terse. If it feels a little too much, that's probably just right to take out all the extra clutter. People just need to be able to read the facts and make their own judgments about it and move on. We'll talk more about tables later, but for now, I'll just say there are formatting guidelines, and you should look at them and follow them when you're submitting your manuscript related to tables and figures. And then, as much as we're going to talk a lot about what not to include, because many DNP initiatives get submitted way too long and have to be pared down, we do want to highlight there are some things you should include. You should include negative results, unexpected results, and lessons learned. So negative results would mean maybe you implemented a project and it didn't accomplish what you were hoping it would. That's really important for you to share because it still helps to move our literature forward by telling people, okay, based on all of the literature, this looked like it was a good plan. We tried it, it didn't work. So now you know what not to try or what might need to be tweaked or adjusted before you try to do the same thing. Similar with lessons learned. So maybe you got so far into implementation and you ran into challenges. The technology didn't work, you didn't have the right stakeholders involved, or for whatever reason, you kind of got stuck in your project until you found a way around the barrier. That's golden to share in your manuscript because whatever challenges you encountered, more than likely other people who do similar projects are going to encounter. And if they can read about your work and see what you did to get around the problem and move forward, that will benefit others. So do include lessons learned and negative results in your manuscript. We also have a few say this, not that, which stems from the fact that research and scholarly writing really does have its own language and jargon. We have our defined terms that have a specific meaning within the world of academic writing, but might also be a word with a broader, more generic meaning for the rest of the world. So readers, and especially peer reviewers, tend to get stuck on certain words when they're used in a
The
non-research
audio cuts in
way.
and out. Come back.
Are you able to hear me?
Yeah, I'm sorry. My audio's going in and out. I need.
Okay. People can kind of get stuck on certain words if they're used in a non-research way, but they should be used in a research jargon context. So it's important to avoid accidentally committing these language faux pas. The first one is study or research. Do not label your work as a study or as research if it is in fact a quality improvement initiative, an EBP initiative, a program evaluation, anything that is not formal research, because that will cause your peer reviewers to get very much confused and stuck on that point, and it's not going to read smoothly to them. So just don't call it a study if it's not research study. Another word that comes up a lot is specific job titles or local jargon that's internal to your organization. So I'll give you one example from my work. You'll have to think about your work and whether the same principle applies. When I was in my first semester of school, like probably all of you, we learned the phrase continuum of care. It's the whole continuum of healthcare from at home to the hospital, clinics, home health, hospice, long-term care, all of healthcare, right? So this is a phrase that has a meaning in the wider world. In my organization where I work, about a year ago, somebody decided to rename our division of home health and hospice as Continuum of Care. When I presented something internally within my organization, I need to use the phrase continuum of care to refer to home health and hospice because that's what will be understood as the name for that division internally. But if I'm writing a manuscript for an external audience, I need to translate that to a term that will be more meaningful to the broader readership. So I would write about it as home health and hospice, not as our internal phrase continuum of care that doesn't have a shared meaning for an external audience. So think about that when you're thinking about what you're writing. Are you writing about specific job titles, divisions, or any other jargon that doesn't translate outside your own organization? If so, think about writing it with a different word in your manuscript. And then lastly, the word significant is really problematic if you're not doing significance testing. So it causes people like me, when we're reading a manuscript, our brains to kind of short circuit when we see the word significant and are like, wait, I just read this whole thing and there was nothing in there about p-values or statistically significant anything. What did I miss? And then we go back and reread the whole thing and realize, oh, this author didn't mean that kind of significant. They just meant meaningful, important, valuable. So if you mean that something was really valuable and important, please use those words, because if you use the word significant, a lot of your readers are going to be thinking statistically significant and get stuck looking for where were the statistics reported. So just don't use the word unless you really mean it statistically. All right. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Sue to talk about reporting guidelines.
Okay, so there are reporting guidelines, and we're going to show you the link on the next slide. But, most of our DNP capstone projects and MSN capstone projects tend to be quality improvement, which really fall in the middle there, these Squire guidelines. And Elizabeth's kind of going to go through some of the nuances associated with those guidelines. Now, if you're doing research, there are guidelines for different types of research. For example, there's guidelines called STROBE, which are for observational studies. Now, EVP is it's kind of a loose, there's really not specific guidelines for EVP. So on the next slide, I'm going to share with you some guidelines for that. Okay, so the next slide, I think, is this is the Equator Network. So it stands for, you can see what it stands for down there. It's the hub for all these publishing guidelines. Then you ask yourself, well, why do we have to have these guidelines? Why can't I just write my project this way and have another journal do it that way? Well, we're looking for consistency, right? In presentation of our scholarly work. And if you're publishing your DNP capstone project in the journal, one of our journals, and then you read another journal, let's say Critical Care Nurse, that does a lot of QI, you see, gosh, reporting's the same. You can kind of compare apples with apples in this way because the information or the content is the same. So it really allows for that consistency across our profession when reporting our scholarly work. But you can see on this slide here, let's say you were doing a research, randomized controlled trial, they would have you use consort. There are also guidelines for like clinical practice guidelines. And I know some DNP capstone projects are lending towards clinical practice guidelines. And this site, Equator, will have you have guidelines for that as well. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk about EVP projects because I have come across some manuscripts that have submitted to the journal that really, the author will say, no, this is an EVP project. It's not QI. And since they're not specific guidelines, I reviewed I looked at the journal, The Worldviews on Evidence-Based Practice, with Dr. Melnick as the editor. And this is kind of the format that I found throughout the articles that were published in Worldviews on Evidence-Based Nursing. Introduction, organizational assessment. You talk about your organization. What's the current state in the organization that's driving that project? Clinical inquiry being your PICO question, review of the literature. Then moving on to the right side is some of what Elizabeth alluded to, like your theoretical framework, what framework you use, if it's a theory or some other framework. implementation, outcome, practice, and conclusion. And as Elizabeth talks about some of the Squire guidelines for QI, you're going to see a little bit of an overlap. And even when you think about research, let's say you read research articles, you can see that review of the literature may be reflected when you're reading a research article. So I think the beauty of QI, EBP, and research is you do see some similarities in how we're presenting that scholarly work. So I think that's kind of exciting. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about titles. And think about what grabs you when you open up a journal and you're looking to read some of the articles. Does the title grab you, or does it turn you off? Are some titles really too long? We don't specify exactly word count in our titles, but just think about what you think is too long or too short. But the most important thing is that the title reflects the content. And that is something that is asked on the reviewer forms, where that the reviewers will have to respond to that. Does this title match what you read? And if not, do you have any recommendations to change the title? And make sure it's really clear. Like I was reading something, it had to do something with, it had pressure injury in it, but it wasn't about pressure injuries. It was about, I can't even remember now, some other kind of pressure. But so make sure that the message is clear. And then you may be asked to rewrite it or some suggestions to either change some different words. We do have a few examples on the right side, and I'll be curious what you think. The first one, it takes a village. Successful transition into practice for new graduate nurses. Now, I think that's kind of catchy, like a village, and I see this village and I see these new graduates, and it takes all of us to transition to practice. Now, the second one here, you'll note actually has QI in it. Diabetes management, the power of nurse and health equity and quality improvement. So, you may or may not want to put QI in your title for your capstone project when you want to publish it. But we'll work with you on what would be the best title to capture your content. So yeah, think back on titles. And this title might be different than the title you're going to use if you're submitting it to present a poster or a podium at a conference. Because you might have, in that case, you might tweak your title to kind of reflect the theme of the conference. In this case, with our publications, you're not doing that. You really want to capture the content. So I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth now for our next part.
And I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about the sections of the Squire guidelines for QI-focused papers. The first section, like with just about any kind of article, is going to cover your local problem, explain what the problem is, why it matters, especially to the audience for your journal. So for us, that would typically be ambulatory care nursing. But do think about what's the audience for the journal where I'm submitting this, and tweak your problem significance explanation to match what that group of readers is going to be interested in. Then you do want to include the local context, but you want to be careful that you don't accidentally unblind your article one paragraph in. So, for example, I would not say the name of my organization here, but I would describe it as maybe a large clinic system in southern Wisconsin. Sue would reference a VA system in maybe the southeastern US or maybe in Florida, but we wouldn't name our organizations. And that is important because A, you don't want to unblind for the peer reviewers, and B, you want your readers to be thinking more in terms of where is my organization similar or different from yours, rather than, well, that worked for you at this one very specific location. Like you want them to have a sense of how their organization lines up with yours. Then in your next section, I think it's important to note the Squire guidelines themselves very clearly say you can tweak the headers. You don't have to name it what we named it. You can edit as needed to make the guidelines and the headings that Squire provides work for your publication. And this is salient here because I personally hate their header available knowledge. I would much rather that people use the more traditional term review of literature or literature review, which gets at the same idea. That's a personal preference as an editor, but I think you'll see that in a lot of journals. Even when people are following Squire, they retitle some of the headings to be more aligned with what that journal is used to calling each section. In the review of literature section, you do need to provide a little bit of detail about where you found your literature. So what databases did you use? What were your search terms? Did you have any limiters like a date range or any other limiters that you might have used in your search? Because a lot of your readers are also researchers and they're going to be looking for this level of detail. And a lot of your readers are also people doing the kind of work you're doing, and they're going to want to be able to replicate your work and implement it in their setting. So they need enough information that they can kind of look for the same literature you used and build their projects using that same strategy. Then you're going to give a brief description of the key articles in general, and there's not an absolute rule here, so this is a general. Around 3 paragraphs is usually pretty good. Maybe 1 to summarize overall the literature says this. Here are some key recommendations that you saw across a lot of articles. And then maybe a couple articles giving a little more detail about the findings from the most salient articles, a couple paragraphs summing up the most important research that played into your project. Then you're going to close that section a little bit differently from research. So in a research manuscript, you would close your review of literature by saying, this is where the gaps still are. These are the things that haven't been found yet, and that's the segue into why I did my research study to fill this gap. For a QI project, you're closing with, overall, this is what the literature says we should do. This is what is known and is recommended, and that's going to set you up for, and that's why we did this project, implementing these findings from the literature. So that's kind of how you frame that section. And then moving on through your broader introduction, you're next going to address any frameworks, models, or theories that you used in your project. And again, keep it short, keep it sweet, say what you used, maybe give a couple sentences explaining it, but generally speaking, you're not going to do an in-depth whole paragraph on every component. So for school, you might have been required to write a page each on plan and do and study and act. If that's the case, cut all that down to a single paragraph for your journal. And again, cite your source. People could look it up and get the extended text from the original source if they want to. So do tell people what you used, what were your frameworks, any major assumptions you used, but keep it succinct because you need to leave room for methods, which comes next and has a lot of subpoints. So here you get to revisit your context. In your opening paragraph, you kind of said, we're a clinic system in Wisconsin. Here you get to be a little more specific. Okay, we implemented this at 12 primary care sites in a single metro area, and be a little more specific about your people too. So we included all RNs, LPNs, and MAs, or we included all providers, physicians, NPs, PAs, whomever else. So give people enough context now that they can really get a good sense of where exactly is this being done, what kinds of clinics, what kinds of specialties, what kinds of roles. And I'm speaking to clinic, but the same principle applies if you're writing for acute care or for some other setting. Give people a little bit more so they can match up their mental model with what you actually did. Then you're going to talk about your intervention. That's obviously going to vary based on your project, what you did. Typically, it'll either be a process or structure change, some innovation, or an educational intervention. The key here is that when your reader gets to the end of the manuscript, they should not be scratching their head asking, okay, but what exactly did you do? You need to be clear enough that your intervention, people know what it was that you did for your project. And then that comes to measures. So ideally, in a perfect universe, there would be psychometrically validated instruments that allow you to measure and report valid measurements of everything. But in reality, as you probably know, many times you have to create your own instrument or work with whatever data you can get that's obtainable in your context. So you just need to be clear about describing how did you collect data? What instruments did you use? If you created your own, a survey, for example, talk about that. If you used one that was validated, fabulous. Talk about that. Share the reliability and validity information for that instrument. But one thing that I see a lot of people not take credit for that they really should is when you are creating your own instrument, which instrument is a fancy word usually for survey or whatever data collection tool you used, chances are you did something to establish validity. So don't say, because I made it myself, there's no validity. Talk about what you did do. Did you base it on the findings of your literature? Did you have it reviewed by your committee, your advisor? Did you run it past a few colleagues who are really experts in their work, who could tell you this doesn't make sense, use this word, not that, or yeah, this makes total sense, and it exactly speaks to the issue you're trying to measure. Like any of those things that you did play into the validity of the instrument. And you should take credit for that in this section, explaining how you developed it, how you validated it, so that your readers have a little bit more trust that you did, in fact, measure something in a way that can be useful to them as well. Then your analysis. Typically, your analysis section is going to start with your participant demographics, and this is a good place to put your first table because you can put a lot of information in a little space and not fill up all of your narrative and your word count with the details, but you should include whatever details you have on participant demographics. Sometimes people forget to include this at all, and that makes it hard for your readers then to know really, can I implement what you did? Am I comparing apples to apples? I don't know, because you didn't tell me anything about the people who participated. So do include what you can, especially along lines like educational background, roles, licensures. If you have gender, race, ethnicity data, put that all in a nice little table so your readers can compare, how does this line up with my setting? After your demographics, then you get into the real analysis of your actual data and what you found. Please note, in quality improvement initiatives, it is completely normal and acceptable to only have descriptive statistics. So if all you have are total numbers, ranges, percentages, means, that's fine. Sometimes I see papers where people tried to force data into some fancy inferential statistics that really didn't seem relevant, just kind of for the sake of saying, look, we did fancy statistics. Please don't. If it fits, do it. But if you're doing it just to say you did it, don't. Provide whatever numbers make sense for your project and for the outcomes that you're trying to measure. And then your ethics section should frankly be very short. You should put time and effort into planning with ethics and caring about ethics, but in your reporting, you can keep it pretty simple. Did IRB look at it, and what did they say? And we have a couple sample sentences on the slide here of what that might look like. I like the second one best. It's really short and sweet. IRB deemed the project quality improvement, not research. That is enough to tell your readers, yes, IRB looked at it. Yes, they said I could proceed. So keep that simple. You don't need to tell us if you had to do amendments or fill out more forms or it took 2 or 3 tries to get through IRB. As long as you addressed it, we don't need the details there. So I will pass it back over to Sue, and she's going to talk more about how to shorten.
All right, so appendices. We do not have appendices in our journals. But I was thinking about when might it be appropriate? If your organization has given you permission to include, let's say, a policy, a protocol, a guideline, that may lend itself to an appendices. with permission from your organization. Now, Elizabeth kind of talked about tables and figures, and tables should not, let's see, how can I say this? If you're going to use a table and you're going to describe the table, the description of the table should be little, because the table should be able to speak for itself. So if your table is demographics, like Elizabeth mentioned, you don't have to say everything in detail within the body of the manuscript. It might be general discussion of demographics, but you refer them to the table. Then you ask yourself, and I have reviewed some DNP manuscripts, if you only had 7, 10 subjects, do you need a table for those demographics? Or is it best to just describe them in narrative form in the body of the manuscript? So we think about that as well, because we don't want to have too many tables. We want the tables to be important and supplement what's written narratively. And figures, it's kind of all over the place. If you are using, a figure, let's say you were doing Plan, Do, Study, Act, and there was a figure of it that you got off the internet, so to speak, that shows it in the pie or whatever, you're going to need permission for that, and we will help you with that. If you've created your own figure, like, like some arrows that went from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, that's fine. So that's about figures. Now, sidebars. When might you kind of have a little sidebar? And some journals, I think if you've read, have sidebars. And I always remember, like the American Journal of Nursing, when they would publish research studies, they would have a little sidebar to help you understand what a p-value is, or something related to research. And we can work with you about a sidebar. And, and Elizabeth kind of talked about, let's say with your methodology, Plan, Do, Study, Act, and you just briefly explain the method, but we may create a sidebar which would be more have more explanation to it. So we will work with you on sidebars. And artificial intelligence, I have to make a point that I'm going to say most journals now are addressing AI in reviewing of it. And if you did use AI, you make that statement, you disclose that up front. We do have, regarding plagiarism and stuff, with our publishing staff, we do have a mechanism to review that, to detect any plagiarism. But be very cognizant of AI, because it really is a hot topic in the publishing arena. Okay, next slide. Let's talk about the abstract, right? You often write it after you're done, right? Because then you cut little bits and pieces out of your manuscript. And every journal has a different approach to abstracts. And so make sure you read the author guidelines for the journal. I always remember, like the Academy of Med-Surg Nursing, their journal called Med-Surg Nursing, I forgot, it's like 30 or 50 words. That is it, with no format to it. We don't have a specific format for your abstract with the Journal of Ambulatory Care Nursing, so we kind of work with you regarding the abstract. But remember, the abstract does kind of call you. I don't know if when you guys read journals, you read the title, then you read the abstract, and then you kind of decide, oh, I guess I'll read the article, or nope, I got what I need from that abstract. So the abstract should tell your story, but really short, sweet, and to the point. And you can see here some suggestions. Key results and implications, and as ambulatory care nurses, make sure that your implications address ambulatory care nursing. That's what's really key to get published in our 2 journals. Recently I reviewed a manuscript, I think it had to do about vaccines, but there was nothing about ambulatory care nursing. I thought it was a good manuscript. It wasn't a DNP project, but I said, you got to talk about ambulatory care nursing. That's what we want in our journal. Now, the abstract you write for the journal for either of our publications, well, there's no abstract in Viewpoint, okay? But if the abstract you write for the Journal of Ambulatory Care Nursing may be different than the abstract you write for the conference to do a poster or podium. So just be cognizant of that. Sometimes you can take your abstract from your publication, just dump it into the abstract for the conference, but not always. make sure you address the problem and the purpose. And the purpose is usually just a one-liner. The purpose of this quality improvement project was to X, Y, and Z. That's it. Short and sweet. And then, keep the text relevant to the audience of the journal, like I talked about. And as our journal gets published, the Journal of Ambulatory Care Nursing, look at those abstracts and tailor your abstract around those. Because if we've accepted that format, that'll guide you in writing your own abstract. And the methods section is once again shortened to the point. Of course, with the methods section with your QI project is going to be something like the Plan, Do, Study, Act method guided this quality improvement project, that da-da-da-da-da. And regarding like the surveys, you don't have to get into a big itinerary about the surveys. We use 3 surveys to capture to address the PICO question or whatever. So short, to the point, but enough information that it kind of tickles the readers to like read the whole article. I think that was, I think that's all I wanted to say about that. On to Elizabeth.
And I will talk a little bit about APA pain points. These are things that we see very often and just want to remind everybody. Starting with, do not capitalize every word in the title of an article. And I totally know why this happens. A lot of times people read the article and they see it was printed in the journal with every word capitalized, so they want to copy it exactly as it was in the journal, but don't. Because even though it was published that way, when you cite the article, you need to follow APA. So you capitalize the first word, and then if there's a subtitle after a colon, capitalize the first word after the colon. Otherwise, everything should be lowercase. Then every citation needs to have a reference, and every reference needs to have a corresponding citation somewhere in the narrative. And I think most people understand that and do really well with it initially, but then you revise and somebody says, move this section here, shorten that, move a paragraph, I'll cut that. And if you aren't thinking to go back through all your references after the revision, sometimes you can end up with a mismatch where you no longer have a reference or an in-text citation that matches. So make sure that you check for that, especially after the revision process. And then while we're talking about citations, be aware that sometimes citation software or that handy dandy cite this, just copy paste here that you'll see in PubMed or a lot of other programs, it's not always right. A lot of times what actually comes out is kind of a mishmash that's half APA and half MLA and not correct for anybody. So use that, but then double check it and fix it as needed. Similarly, if you're using reference management software like EndNote, Mendeley, Zotero, those kind of programs, I love them, they're wonderful, except they're not wonderful when you need to fix something they got wrong, and all of that coding is still in the document behind the scenes. So if you know what I'm talking about, because you've used this kind of software, turn that off before you submit the manuscript. You want just the actual words, not the software running behind it that keeps fighting with you every time you try to fix something that was incorrectly formatted. So turn that off. Then make sure that all the URLs are functional. Typically in an academic manuscript, you won't necessarily have URLs in the body of the manuscript, but you often will in your references. DOI numbers convert to URLs. Sometimes websites might have a URL. So click those links and make sure that they actually work and they go where you think they go before you submit your manuscript. When you have an article with more than 20 authors, follow APA guidelines. You need to include up to 20 authors, but caveat, here's where you also need to double check your author guidelines because Viewpoint, for example, to conserve space, even though we use APA 7 in general, we use APA 6 on this point. So you don't have quite as many author names taking up space. So when your author guidelines diverge in some way from APA or MLA or whatever the official style guide for the journal you're submitting to, if the author guidelines call out something specific where they diverge, follow the author guidelines on that point. Then speaking of APA, You don't use retrieved from unless the website you're citing has no date. So just kind of pay attention to that. It's a little nuance that people sometimes miss. We talked about table formatting guidelines. Another common error we see, and I think this too comes from the fact that in normal writing emails, writing letters, writing to colleagues, we try to switch up our terms so that we don't sound like a broken record repeating the same word over and over. This is academic writing. You should sound like a broken record, pick the term you're going to use, and just use that name for it throughout the manuscript. And then if it has an abbreviation, introduce the abbreviation the first time you use the term, and then use the abbreviation consistently throughout the manuscript. If you're not used to doing that, it feels a little wrong. Feels like you should vary it a little bit, but don't, because you will get called on it and asked to revise and standardize. It's just the way academic writing works. Then when you are citing sources in your in-text, paraphrasing is strongly preferred over direct quotes. But if you are going to directly quote because you need to for some reason, make sure you include the page number in the in-text citation. With a paraphrase, you still have to have an in-text citation, but you don't need the page number. A lot of us have gotten out of the habit of ever indenting paragraphs because it's not standard in our emails and a lot of electronic communications. But APA still says you need to indent your paragraphs, so double check for that. And then headings. APA has 5 levels of headings. You typically only use the first 2 or 3 in most articles, but do look at those heading guidelines if this is not something that you've done a lot, and make sure you know which ones should be centered, which should be flush left. Are they bolded? Do they need italics? Check your APA guidelines for the headings that you are using. And then finally, use inclusive language. APA says to use inclusive language and provide specific details on that. We also affirm that in both our publications. We want to see inclusive language. So that could include things like using a plural they or you, they, them, a singular. Sorry, I think you know what I'm trying to say. They, them can be singular or plural, and other related terms that you see sometimes. If you're not sure whether we want you to go with like traditional English or more inclusive, we want the inclusive language. So there's your APA overview. I'm going to switch now a little bit to talk about the publication process, just in general, what to expect, especially for those of you who've never been through a peer review process, just so that you have a sense of what's normal, what's the next step, how long does it take? Spoiler, it takes forever, and that's completely normal. But the actual submission will often be electronic. I think our journals are a little bit easier than most to submit to because you can just email us. Most are an electronic platform like Editorial Manager, and it can be a kind of lengthy and confusing process, especially the first time. So block yourself a good chunk of time, 1 to 2 hours, because you're probably going to need to create an account, and then you might have to go make an ORCID ID that you didn't know about before that, and then come back and finish making your account. And then you'll go to upload your manuscript and find out, oh, this journal wants you to save each section separately in different files. So you have to stop and do that. Just plan on it taking a while. Be patient with yourself. You'll get it submitted eventually. In general, most journals are going to ask you to have on separate files your title page, which is not going to be seen by the peer reviewers, then all of your main body of your article, then on separate files, each figure and table individually. So just kind of be prepared for that. If you encounter page limit issues, consider labeling your figures or tables as supplemental digital content, which means it won't be printed or included. If it's an electronic journal, it won't be in the main body of the article, but there will be a link to it that people can click that link or scan a code, go see your figure on a separate browser window or on their phone, and then come back to your article. So it's a way of getting around page limits. So consider using that if you're having space issues. Once you submit the article, it might be pre-reviewed by an editorial staff member. And in that case, they're checking for, did you check all the boxes? Did you include all the parts? Did you put your name where it was supposed to be and not put it where it's not supposed to be? So basically just compliance with submission requirements. It's very common for you to miss something and to get an email saying, you missed this form, or you needed to sign here, or you missed a box, and we can't process your submission until you fix it. If that happens, don't worry about it. It has absolutely no bearing on the ultimate decision to accept or reject your manuscript. So just fix the problem, resubmit, and move on. It's no biggie. After that, your article actually makes it to an editor, and the editor will review it and decide to either politely decline or send it on to peer reviewers. If we reject an article, it's usually not because there's anything wrong with the article. It's usually either it's just not a good fit for our audience. So like sometimes people send us hospital-based manuscripts and we have an ambulatory audience. They're not going to be interested. Or sometimes it's an article on a topic that we already just accepted another article on, and there's no way in the world you would have known that. But we know that we can't take another article on that topic for a little while. So typically, if you get a rejection, yeah, it feels bad. Sit with it for a minute, and then pivot to your next choice journal and start all over again. If your article got sent to peer review, then this is going to take several weeks. In my experience, most often it takes around 5 or 6 weeks to get feedback, but I have been as long as 5 months and as short as 3 weeks. So it just completely depends. The editor might have trouble finding peer reviewers or might have to send a few reminders to a peer reviewer to get it done. So don't worry if it's been a while and you haven't heard anything. Trust the process. If you are worried, you can always email the editor and check where's it at, but it just takes a while. Once the peer reviewers send all their feedback, the editor will send you a decision, and it's either going to be reject, which at that point will usually come with some really helpful feedback that you can use to revise the manuscript before you send it on to your next choice journal. Or, in rare cases, it could be accept. Don't expect that. It is not normal to get an accept after a first round of peer review. So don't feel bad if you don't get an accept right away. Most often, you're going to get a revise and resubmit, which means here's all the feedback from the peer reviewers. We want you to look at it. We want you to revise where you see that it's appropriate, and then resubmit it. And we'll give you usually a due date within typically about 2 to 4 weeks. You can request an extension. I have never heard of any editor declining a request for an extension. So if the timing doesn't work for you, you have a co-author who needs to sign off on it and they're out of the country, whatever, that's fine. But you do eventually need to revise and resubmit. And then once that comes back, the editor will either send it back to peer review, which is normal, especially if there were major revisions, or if there were very minor revisions and the editor can see that you addressed them, they might just go ahead and accept it at that point. If it goes back to peer review, you're going to rinse and repeat the cycle, getting the peer review feedback, making a decision from there, and repeat as many times as necessary until you do finally reach either a sorry, this just isn't going to work for us, or yes, we can accept the article now. And then it goes into queue. At that point, you have no control over how long it takes to actually get published, but you can put it on your CV as in press because it has been accepted. So that's the overall overview of our general publication process. And I believe Sue had some things to add to that.
Yeah, I want to make a few comments. So, when your manuscript first gets submitted to the Journal of Ambulatory Care Nursing, like Elizabeth said, our publishing staff will kind of make sure everything's there, and then it'll be sent to the editor. Sometimes, let's say you submit a manuscript as a DNP project and you didn't follow the Squire guidelines. I will probably send it back, but we'll send it back to you saying, hey, all the content is there, but you need to reformat it, put it into the Squire guidelines, give it back to us, and then I can send it on for peer review. There are times where as an editor, I think it's a good article, like I want this manuscript to get published, but then when it goes to the review process, the reviewers aren't as favorable. So then it's kind of like a discussion, a kind of a, how do we do, what's the decision? And, you know, to kind of a, as an editor, have to kind of look at those comments if they're justified. And as Elizabeth alluded, we have about 30 some reviewers for the Journal of Ambulatory Care Nursing. A lot of them are, you know, PhD prepared who think they're reading it like a research article, manuscript versus a DNP capstone QI project. So I always have to remind them of that. And we do have two different forms. So if you, when you submit your DNP QI project, we have a different form for that versus research. But still, we have to remind my reviewers that this is a QI project. So we're constantly trying to make sure we're reviewing it from the right lens. Now, when you get revisions, you know, what I do is I'll send bullet points. So let's say there are 10 things I would like you to address. I put them in bullet points. Now you ask yourself, well, how do you respond back with your changes? You could take that email and respond directly to those bullet points, or people make a table and you put my 10 bullet points on the one column, and then on the other column, you say on page 5, I revised this, on page 10, I deleted this. So, but you need to communicate back how you did the requested revisions. So we can kind of, but you need to communicate that in the best way so that the editor is really clear that you made the revisions. As an editor, if I feel like your revisions were great, I can go on and accept it. If I want another set of eyes, like Elizabeth said, we may send it back to all of the reviewers or maybe just one reviewer to get that additional set of eyes. But we have, I'm going to say we have a friendly process because our goal, and I think there are so many fantastic DNP projects out there, and I'm so happy that AAACN has created this journal that can provide a venue to disseminate some of that good work we're doing related to ambulatory care nursing. So I'm very, very excited about that. Now, Journal of Ambulatory Care Nursing, there's only going to be 3 issues quarterly. So you may get something accepted now, but it might not be published for a little while. We were kind of trying to map all that out. And you might be asked to once again review your references, because maybe in the window between acceptance and publishing, some things may have happened, and we may have asked you to look at your references because there may be something more current that we need to include. And if you are using like a reference from 1995, it's often related to either this theory or the tool, but we may ask you, why are you including this old reference? And you need to come back and say, well, that's the gold standard for X, Y, or Z. So as Elizabeth and you and I, we are friendly editors. We want to work with everybody because our role is to help you succeed in disseminating your scholarly work. So I think that's it, right, Elizabeth?
Yep, we do have some references here. And then probably more helpful, we have contact info here. We have a few minutes left for questions, which feel free to put those in the chat or come off mute and ask. But also, if you think of something later, or if we run out of time today and you still have questions, please do feel free to reach out to either of us, and we will be happy to continue the conversation. So we
While you're
have
saying that, Elizabeth, I'll just add, let's say you submit a journal to Viewpoint or a manuscript to Viewpoint, but Elizabeth may say, gee, this would be really good for JACN. She might pass it on to me and we might have a discussion and then work with the author to see if they're in agreement to move it this way, and vice versa. If I get something for my journal and I think, well, I think it's a better fit for Viewpoint, we have that dialogue. So either way, we're trying to work with you to see how we can get you published.
All right, so what questions do you have?
All right, I think I hope we, imparted useful information, to ensure your success in submitting these manuscripts. And I think that was our goal here, is to, yeah, I love the slide about the APA pain points, because it can be painful, as you guys know. And what I found, because I teach at the DNP level as well, and your faculty or your may not have been so anal, for sake of a better word, on some of these APA nuances. But for publishing, we are very clear about following the guidelines and following the APA formatting. So, you might say, well, I submitted my paper for school. They didn't ask for all these kind of changes, but remember, school is different than disseminated through these other scholarly mechanisms.
So Albin asked, what are some ambulatory DNP projects being considered for publications?
I think it's the whole gamut. I mean, I think of, like, I'm thinking of some students I work with or some of the publications that I have seen. Let's say you were doing a QI project on revamping your code card in ambulatory care, thinking, why do we need 500 things on it when we only use 20? That's an example. Let's say you're doing an education intervention. You're educating ambulatory nurses on the importance of social determinants of health. But you've got some data, you've got, and you had a pretty good sample size and stuff like that. It can be education, a clinical practice guideline, improving a process, within ambulatory care nursing. I think it's really limitless. What do you think,
I
Elizabeth?
saw one fairly recently on improving vaccination rates for flu vaccine. I've seen others related to different quality indicators that were being tracked. I think those are pretty common. Falls.
Falls, we've seen some with falls, how if you're reducing falls in an ambulatory care setting. We've had some of those DNP projects submitted. Just send it our way, and we'll figure it out with you.
Hi, this
Any
is
other
Carrie
questions?
Shipman.
Hey,
I
Carrie.
can't figure out how to raise my hand, so I apologize for just jumping in here. Thank you so much for this presentation. Super helpful. I had submitted a query letter, so I'm currently in the process of working on my manuscript with my faculty mentor. It's a requirement for class that I actually submit my manuscript. So one question I had, just high level, which you had talked about breaking down the paragraphs, which I found super helpful. Can you give us an idea of roughly how many pages? And I know that's kind of a loaded question because it's probably going to depend on the topic, but is there a suggested number of pages that I should expect to stay within? My paper currently for school is 80 some pages. Now, I got heartbroken when she went through and started slashing big X's. I was like, wait a minute, that's a lot of hard work there, but I get it. It doesn't, you got to get down to the nitty gritty, which is what I look for when I'm doing reviews, to pull out, of what's going to support my work. So can you share with us, is there a suggested number of
I
pages
would
that we should?
aim for about 16 pages, double spaced, including references. That's an estimate. Some journals will let you go a little more. 17 or 18 is often fine. Really depends on the journal and how hard of a line they take. For myself, if I tell you around 3,500 words and you send me 3,800 words plus a long table, if it's a good article, I'll make room for it. But I have published in some places that were like, nope, 16 is the cutoff and that's it. So just kind of depends.
That's helpful.
And I haven't
Thank you
really
for
been
that.
having a cutoff. That question was asked, how many pages? I like people to write, be succinct, follow the guidelines, and then we'll take it from there. Because Carrie, I sense you're so passionate about your project. You put your life, your work into this and getting you this degree, and you want to tell everything, but if there is the challenge with page numbers, we think about tables and stuff that could supplement more of the narrative. So I'm kind of more like, we don't really have a specific number. Now we only do about 3 articles in each journal moving forward. We may go to more. We have to ask the board of directors for, the budget issue to get more pages. But follow the guidelines, follow the Squire guidelines, and I think they're going to help you narrow it down a little bit when it's quality improvement.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
Another thing I would say in your situation, Carrie, if you are writing about something where anyone in your field would be expected to know it. Like, for example, what is a flu vaccine and how was it administered? Your school might have made you give a lot of detail, but if you think your audience can be trusted to know, cut that detail all out, make it a sentence where it was a paragraph, merge it into a previous paragraph. That's what I see a lot is the school says you have to give expanded text on everything. You can either cut it all out on a topic that you're like, my readers know this, or you can cut it down to an introductory sentence where there was a paragraph. Hopefully that helps.
Okay.
And you're right, it's painful to cut all that stuff that you just put all that work into writing, but it's necessary.
Yeah,
And think
for
about
sure.
the articles you like to read. How long are they? Do you get lost if you're reading a long article? I do. So think, put your own hat on and think, would I want to read this article, or is it really too long? You know? So I think our time is up. I don't want to go over. I want to thank everybody. Elizabeth and I want to thank you wholeheartedly for expressing your interest in turning these DNP projects into manuscripts, and we look forward to getting them all soon. Thank you
Yes.
so
Thank
much,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.